What's going on, Brian? It is right before the Thanksgiving holiday again. It's just me and you. John is still on vacation, but we're looking forward to him joining again here in a couple episodes. But today we talked about innovation, everybody's favorite word.
That's right. And we covered a lot of territory, as we often do. Really kind of talking about the definitions of it. We got into exploring some examples of what are commonly classified as the four categories or four types of innovation. And then we got into some additional context, exploring some of those key innovators globally that have been influential to us or have been influential to the world at large. And we had some interesting insights and tidbits along the way, as well as some examples of some great books or other resources that you might want to check out if innovation is kind of your thing.
Yeah, I would agree. And we kind of went all over the place with this, so don't just think it's us talking about like the newest technology or blockchain, even though we hit blockchain. So don't think it's a conversation just about that. So with that, let's let everyone get on with the show.
Let's do it. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Lead.exe. I'm Brian Comerford in Denver, Colorado.
And I'm Nick Lozano in Alexandria, Virginia.
Changing it up again. I love it.
Hey man, I forgot to do it the last episode, so I just got to roll with it, right?
Fair enough. There are approximate locations. So, Nick, any program that carries technology as one of the facets of its topics at some point has to explore the theme of innovation. It's just about the biggest buzz term that I think we tend to hear as technologists. Would you agree?
I would totally agree, right? And especially, and we've talked about this before, since technology's kind of really been consumerized, when people think of innovation now, they think of Google and what's Apple doing and what's Amazon doing. When that's not always necessarily the case. You don't have to be one of those huge, big players to do something innovative. It could be something as simple as maybe you do a new onboarding process where you onboard your employees and you got this whole formal process. Innovation can be something as simple as that. It doesn't have to be creating the next whiz-bang, NoSQL, whatever you can think of database. Opportunities for innovation are there, and you just don't have to be one of the big tech players.
Yeah, and I think of innovation sort of in the same way that I think of something like CX, right? Client experience. Some of the best enhancements around CX, very similar to some of the best enhancements in innovation, come from making very simple but dramatic changes, right? So, for example, I think about the years that I've spent working in the commercial insurance industry. This is a very paper-intensive industry, one that's all about policies and contracts and lots of things that have historically always been, paper-based. And so you print all that stuff out, you package it, you put, shipping and postage on it, and you send it physically somewhere. And I think a major innovation that came for that industry was just the idea of moving not only to electronic documents like PDFs, but actually then servicing all of that data through a portal where then everything is 100% electronic. You cut down on the paper waste, you cut down on all these additional expenses, all this time that's spent printing and binding and mailing and the time it takes to ship things, so it increased, tenfold in terms of efficiency and savings, but it really wasn't, this great leap forward in terms of, transforming how the business operated. It did transform a very simple touch point within that client experience that is one, kind of analogous to online banking. Before it existed, no one really knew that they needed it. Once it existed, no one would ever do it the other way again, right?
I think you're right. And the online banking is really one one of those things we can think of recently. Maybe when you think of Gen Zers, to them, that's just banking, right? Just like a digital camera is just a camera to them. They don't remember the film days, and don't remember going to the bank because you have to deposit your check. And I remember deposit limits on your bank, right? You used to be able to go to like the ATM and you could do a deposit through there, but it had a limit of like X dollars that you could deposit. But I agree with you. The banking things are a really good example. When you think of really the late 90s when that started coming on, people were deathly terrified of banking online. It was like, oh, whoa, I'm not putting my credit card in this. And you think of today, if I can't pay with my credit card somewhere or debit card, like I don't even want to mess with it. I don't know how you feel about that, but it's little things like that innovations where things start small and then they have this snowball effect to where it can affect culture as a whole. And like we were saying earlier, you don't have to start with some big grand scheme vision to get there. Your example of the commercial insurance space was heavily paper based. Right, let's just switch to making it PDFs. Can we start there? Can we start small and work our way to something and think about the client experience, customer experience? Whoever you service, it's a customer, a client, an employee or whatever. If you just think about that experience from that perspective, a lot of times you can find innovative things to do when you put yourself in the shoes of your client or your customer or your end user.
Yeah, I think all that's absolutely true. And something we don't do very often, Nick, is solicit feedback from our listenership. But for this episode in particular, I think it would be interesting if folks would drop into the comments wherever they're sourcing this podcast, some of the things that they believe might actually contribute as innovations to their own particular lines of business.
Yeah, that's a great example. I feel like that'd be good to have for a live stream, right? Because then we could see the comments in real time. So maybe we'll plan that for a live stream too, after the new year. When most of our listener base is in the United States, and recording this close to Thanksgiving, and the holidays in December, and a lot of the business world in the U.S. kind of shuts down around those times. I don't know how it is for you, Brian, but around here in D.C., the city gets quiet, and things just seem to kind of slow down as people are spending times with their families. But as you are saying, I completely agree that soliciting feedback is one of those great ways to get ideas for innovation. And especially feedback from frontline workers, right? People who have boots on the ground, who are interacting with your clients or your customers full time. I think a lot of times when organizations are looking for innovations, a lot of times they reach out to management and middle management, and it never makes its way all the way down to the bottom.
That's true. And I think very commonly, the inverse is also true. You see some of the greatest innovations come from those frontline workers. That tends to be, where the ideas start cooking, in terms of if only this could happen this other way, everything would be so much better. And so, from a basic definition of innovation, I think that's a good way to qualify it, right? It's a new method or a new product. It's something that results in improving whatever, currently exists, or introducing something that didn't exist before, where there's a need, but the need isn't necessarily recognized. Do you agree with that as a definition, or are there other things that you would add into that?
No, I agree. And I think you hit all the points that I would say too. It doesn't have to be something new, right? We just talked about earlier, like you don't have to reinvent something to have something innovative. It could be as simple as a frontline worker saying, hey, you give these people too much paper, they throw it all in the garbage can. Why are we printing paper? It's like, right there, that could be an innovative thing and save the company millions of dollars if your organization is based on just printing paper and giving it to people and them throwing it in the garbage.
Yeah, saving time, saving energy, saving money, right? reducing expenses, reducing waste. Any of those things I think can help contribute to what gets qualified as an innovative idea. So that led me to. Oh, go ahead, Nick.
No, I just wanted to bring up a point because when we were talking about innovation, it reminds me of remember when we had Peter Margaritas on, I think the first time, and he was talking about fostering ideas from people and getting them together in a room, and he's like, hey, we don't want any safe ideas here. Throw out the craziest idea you have. We're not going to worry about how it gets done or how it's accomplished, but it's just that going through that thought process of throwing an idea out there to see if you can find something to work with. And I think you made the comment when he said that too about Seth Godin. Remember, I think you said, what is it like? Safe is risky,
safe
risky is safe.
Risky is safe. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and when you were saying all that, it just reminded me of when we had that conversation with him, and he's like, hey, I just want, the craziest ideas you can give me out here so that we can start, fostering this creativity process.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because it is a process. I think, ideas only exist in community, right? So once you start the process of ideation and you solicit feedback and you start through sharing, then that collaboration can continue to refine it until, really you reach something where all the considerations have been, kind of turned over in the process of looking at what that change could bring. As we've been talking about this, it occurred to me that in my own years of actually having director of innovation in my title, there was a framework, that we would use that included the 4 types of innovation. We would kind of use it as a filter by which we would run through some of these ideas, and we kind of covered it through some of our definitions already. But the 4 types of innovation in this particular framework that I used to use from a company called Ignition, there's sustaining, disruptive, new market, and integrative. And so sustaining, being one of those keeping the lights on while keeping the customers happy, initiatives. And so I think that kind of correlates to what we were talking about with, moving from purely paper-based to electronic, and then, electronic delivery. It's still just part of how the business needs to operate. You kind of can't get out from under it, but at least you can improve what the client experience is on the other end of it, by actually simplifying everything and not giving someone a binder full of paper that is just going to gather dust on their shelf. So then the second one is disruptive, low-cost alternative enabled by new technology. So what are some examples that come to mind for you of something that you would qualify as disruptive?
Disruptive. So we always have our classic examples of something that was disruptive that came along. And I'll always give the Kodak one, right? It's looking at seeing a threat coming, right? So if people aren't familiar, Kodak was like the film company for like most things, movies, cameras, anything. If you had to print an image or a photo, it was on Kodak film most of the time. And as digital started coming up, they weren't paying attention to it, thinking it was just a niche market, that it wasn't going to go anywhere. And by the time they realized that they were in trouble, it was already too late. They had already lost tons of market share. They went far too far down the road, and they couldn't recover. And another good example is what? BlackBerry too, right? As tech people, a lot of us had BlackBerries before the iPhone came along. It was the coolest thing in the world, right? When you had that full keyboard and the little scroll wheel. And even before that, they had the pager. And it's one of those things, right? They were a top market player. And then here comes Apple, and they're like, okay, well, we don't have to worry about it too much. We have this big business segment market who buy our servers, and, we're all about security. And then eventually they found out that as technology was being consumerized, that those people didn't want BlackBerries. They wanted to use their iPhones because it was easier to use than than, the BlackBerry and trying to navigate with the touch ball. So I would say those are two really classic examples of me where things started out small. It looked like a very niche thing, and then it eventually exploded and became super consumerized, and people got left in the dust.
That's interesting because I also would put the mobile phone, I would personally classify that in the last category around integrative. And so integrative is, multiple jobs to be done in one elegant solution. So I think to your point, the BlackBerry was the first to market to do that. And I think was really forward thinking in the sense that the realization was we need to bring together a number of these things that are commonly used by the average business person, right? We need mobile access to email. That's the most critical one. And we've talked about this before, but it's often, recognized as the number one most critical business application for any business, right? Email. It's a conduit that has to be open at all times, right? But number two, then it gave you a couple of these other things. It gave you a simplistic browser. It gave you a way to do simplistic file storage, right? There was a maps feature in it, right? All of these things that were sort of the basis of what became, just what mobile phones are in general. I think the real disruptive thing that Apple did was it came along and it provided that in an even more elegant type of approach by adding the touch screen, but more importantly, by also adding the app exchange so that, now you've got this ability to invite other developers and other creators into your ecosystem that could develop their own utilities. And so then all of a sudden you see this explosion of things like, well, I don't just need a phone. I need to be able to play this, Angry Birds video game on it, right? Because that's what you do when you swipe on these things.
That, or what was the other one that was popular? Fruit Ninja. That was a pretty popular game too, I remember.
That's right, Fruit Ninja.
But I agree,
Candy
that's
Crush.
one of those cases where, Apple's really good at this. And, I'm always a fan of them from a technology perspective. I'm not a super fan. I don't like every product they release. But one thing that they are really good at is they tend to not be first in any category that they do, right? When you think about the iPod, that was not the first MP3 player. What was the first one? It was like a Rovio or something like that. They have a really good mentality of looking at a product and saying, okay, this has the potential to be huge, but it is super complicated to figure out. So let's refine this process, make it as simple as we can, and then release it. And that has worked really well for them over the years. What are they, like a market cap of like $2 trillion?
Something like that.
They were the first
$1
trillion company. Now they're two. And they've really made the living off that iPod that then turned into the iPhone and taking those products and making it simpler. Because I think even when Steve Jobs came back, he chopped the number of products that they were producing, right? He's like, hey, if we can't be number one or number two in any category, I don't want to make it. I could be misremembering this, but I think when I read his book, the Walter Isaacson one, he had, there was like some quote about that right when he came in. Maybe a listener can correct me if I'm wrong and I'm thinking of someone else, but that's a great mentality, right? Let's make this as simple as we can and focus on the things we can control and focus at the one or two things that we can make better. And I don't know how I got there, but here we are.
No, that's great. It's funny that you bring up the iPod, because for this last category in the 4 types of innovation, new market, right? The definition being modifying existing solutions for new markets. That took me directly to my years in the music industry. And so as an internet radio entrepreneur, I was, on the front end of that wave of everything that happened with digital distribution in the music industry. And it started off, pretty simply enough with the real player and real producer. And those were, that was it.
Oh,
that
man.
was how you listened to audio on the web,
and you had to install the real player, or else like none of the codecs worked or anything. I remember that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, and it was pretty, low resolution at that time. I mean, it was like, 16-bit, and then it, continued to improve and everything. But, what really became sort of the new market transformation, I think, because internet radio was sort of it was a slow crawl, forward. And so it didn't scare the music industry. In fact, I remember sitting in LA, at the Record Industry Association of America, their annual conference, and they trotted out this annual report, as they always did. And in that report, they, for the first time in 1998, acknowledged that, there was going to be digital distribution of music, but here's why. They were here to put the music industry to rest, because there's no reason to worry about it. We're going to figure it all out before it has a chance to happen. And it can't happen for several reasons. Number one, broadband wasn't ubiquitous. Number two, file sizes for quality music, they're just far too large. And so you put those two things together, people can't get access to quality music. Well, within 3 months of that report, the MP3 codec was cracked and publicly released. Napster emerged, and all of a sudden, you had all of these different streaming capabilities that were utilizing MP3 versus, real audio or Windows Media that came after it. And that ended up being completely disruptive, from a new market perspective to the established music industry, because now you have all these players that are facilitating something in a much better way, as an existing solution. And not only that, I think it tapped into that new market basis where you started seeing purchasing habits that were directed in a very different way. The 45 single had always been kind of the low price point to get into acquiring music. But that kind of, moved away at the advent of the CD. And so it became very difficult for people to just spend a little bit of money, if that's all they had, to be able to acquire a song. But once the MP3 codec was released, suddenly it was very easy to acquire a single song or only a couple songs from an album, in a very individualized kind of way. And that's really where Steve Jobs, I think, came and capitalized on it, because iTunes didn't deliver anything that didn't already exist at that time. He just was able to leverage consumerizing it in a very elegant way by attaching it to a specific product with the iPod, and then creating the iTunes store to have, that fully licensed ecosystem, where Napster was sort of the Wild West's, illegal equivalent of all of that.
I actually like that you bring that example up, and that Napster is a direct reflection of an industry not listening to its consumers, right? The only reason that piracy happened, well, granted, some people wanted free music, right? I mean, those people wouldn't have bought it even if the media companies created Napster, right? If they created that and set it out, those aren't the people who would buy anyways. But it was a reflection of the ease of access to get that media was super difficult. What did you have to do to get a CD before? You had to go to, a Sam Goody, FYE, name one of the dozen record stores that doesn't exist anymore, where you would go, wait in line, and hope that you could get one of the number of copies that they had that were coming to that store. And it's just, people leveraging the internet, deciding that, hey, this is not a solution that's working for anybody. Let's decentralize that and make it so that it gives access to everybody. And a great example of that now is blockchain, right? I'm not huge on the cryptocurrency part of it, but the idea of decentralizing stuff and making access where you don't have to go to one central location to get something, to me is where the great thing that comes out of the cryptocurrency, not necessarily the currency itself, but the decentralization and multiple nodes that are spread out across the globe, where if one node goes down, you can still access something. Or if you're in Australia, which everyone knows if you've been to Australia, they have notoriously slow internet if you're trying to access anything that is not in Australia. But when you think about it, you got to go across oceans to get anywhere. So you're either going satellite or an ocean cable that's buried underground. So it's just one of those things where we see technologies coming, and it's literally just people trying to create solutions to solve their problems.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up cryptocurrency. There's a book that I read recently called New Money for a New World, and it's actually about complementary currencies. And so at the same time that we've got this rise of crypto, and again, I think, from my perspective, the jury's kind of out in terms of, what is really needed from that solution. Although I think if we had our guest David Campbell from Electric Coin back on the show, he would probably school us on all the reasons why you believe it is.
Disclaimer, we're not experts in that segment. So
that's right.
Just all my opinions. Yep.
But, I agree that that blockchain, it's something that I think is critical from really from a risk management perspective, if nothing else, in terms of, managing fraud and doing it in a very simplified kind of way so that you have it. You have these things like contracts that are distributed so that, you've effectively got an unmalleable pristine copy of the original intent. I think those things are going to continue to have a lot of influence in the domain where contract language is, particularly needed. But on the topic of complementary currency, part of what I think is interesting is, you made the comment about a lot of these innovations come from individuals trying to solve their needs. And complementary currency is one of those areas where, so in Argentina, for example, it's one of the sort of case studies in this book where there are complementary currencies that can be provided to people who will do a public service. And so, for example, for children who want to be able to get together enough funding to be able to help buy some groceries for their families, they can pick up trash in the neighborhood communities along the sides of the roads. And for, however many pounds of trash or bags of trash, whatever it is that they bring in, then they get a credit through this complementary currency. And that complementary currency can be exchanged just as any ordinary currency could for other goods and services, because there has been a decision for the community to participate in this type of network, which is what makes that whole thing possible. It's like there's an agreement now that there's going to be this transition into what the value of money, right? How that's assessed. And so what's happening is, for some of these communities that are suffering with a lot of poverty and where there aren't opportunities for more employment, but there's still needs for things like public services, suddenly what you're seeing is this emergence of behavior change within a society that's actually also contributing to uplifting a status of poverty, for those who are most in need. So that, to me, I think is a pretty, revolutionary type of innovation, and one that would have wide-reaching impact across the globe when you consider that roughly about 7 billion people on the planet are suffering in poverty, which is a lot. That's a huge majority.
It's all great points. And the thing I always find funny with cryptocurrency, and maybe somebody can explain this to me, is that they're like, it's decentralized money, right? But every time I see its value, it's always pegged to the US dollar. So I'm like, wait, so is this really decentralized? Because if I need to take cryptocurrency somewhere, it gets a value based on the US dollar. So to me, is it any different than like a commodity? I don't know. I digress, though.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about, who are some of the world's greatest innovators. There are some that I think immediately jump to mind because they're constantly in the media, especially lately.
Yeah. So if I had to take one innovator, and I'm going to pick somebody not technology, right? I would have to go with Ed Catmel from Pixar. And I've talked about him before, but it's just when you think about the stuff that they achieved at Pixar as a studio, yeah, they did the computers, the first to do like a full animated movie, computer generated. But what they really did really well was package products with storytelling and movies that were just bang on. Because before that, Disney used to release, right? So backstory, Toy Story, right? They released that, big hit in theaters. The original contract they had with Disney was that then Disney would get the rights to sequel movies and they would release them home on home video, right? That was a big thing with Disney. If you had kids or something, you recognize this, pull up your Disney Plus and you'll see movies that you didn't even know that they made. And that's because it went home to movie. But they had creative control over kind of the product that Disney was going to make, because this was before Disney owned them. And as they were looking at the story that they were creating for Toy Story 2, they decided that they didn't like basically the way the story went. So they took a risk and took back control, put a lot of money into making a second movie, which normally for Disney was huge flops. And they put out Toy Story 2, and it was a huge success. And basically they followed their same innovative formula they had for storytelling, coming in, figuring out how characters behave, and going through their storyboarding and basically their peer reviews of movies to create something innovative. And look at them now. Like, how many Toy Story movies are there? There's like 4. How many other sequel movies do they have that are based on their other movies? And you can see that kind of living on in the Disney animation studios, because some of the Pixar people are in charge at the Disney animation studios too. So you can see that with newer kids movies too, like Frozen. There's a second Frozen. It was just as big as the first one, if not bigger. So I would have to add him in that lump as innovative people. And it's probably a different one for people who listen to this episode or show.
Yeah, well, there's, you and I have talked about just the proliferation of good news that's out there and how easy it is to be optimistic if that's the choice that you orient, your perception towards. And so to me, it's fascinating, just, one after another. There are innovations all over the world right now, and the rate of innovation continues to accelerate. Terence McKenna talked about this when he developed the mathematical algorithm for what he called time wave zero, where he was able to mathematically calculate the algorithm of the doubling of human knowledge, right, over time, from the Stone Age all the way up through the Information Age, until he was able to calculate, his presumption of what the rate would be, where the rate of innovation doubled every second, right? And that's what he called time wave zero. That correlates also to what Ray Kurzweil has talked about as the singularity, right? That point at which humans and machines will become so interdependent that they'll start to become indistinguishable from one another. So, as you look around and you see all of these different areas of innovation, there's innovation, in every country in the world. And there's, I think, a lot of information to pay attention to, in this domain if you choose to. So there's of course the big top names that we constantly hear. Steve Jobs still has this lasting influence, of course. But even Bill Gates is having a lot of innovative strides forward with the work that he's been doing with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Certainly transforming, health, and now his focus on environment. Those will continue to yield tremendous innovations. And then, of course, someone like Elon Musk, he's innovated in so many different domains already. It's exciting just to see kind of what the next step is, and is spawning additional, emulators. So I think of like Rivian being a competitor now to what Tesla has developed, and really building on sort of that base principle of the electric car and extending, those capabilities to now be long range and be able to tow heavy loads and that sort of thing. But then, there's also areas that are often overlooked. So I had to Google this woman's name real quick because I couldn't remember what it is, but I had read something in Fortune magazine not too long ago about Sheila Lyrio Marcelo, and she is the founder of Care.com. And, her story is a pretty interesting one too, because she was born and raised in the Philippines, but then she was able to get her MBA and doctorate at Harvard. And part of what she saw was that there was this opportunity through a combination of both social media and technology to be able to easily reach people all over the world who needed more help, and particularly, starting with help around elder care. And so part of the concept being that, leveraging the same kinds of mobile capabilities that something like Facebook have been able to, do for just social interaction. Here she was able to leverage that same kind of thing where in a lot of countries, people don't have computers and they don't necessarily have broadband, but they do have mobile phones, and they've got smartphones that give them some kind of browser-based access or app-based access. So Care.com ended up being something that she was able to create to help drive caregivers to those in need and be able to help create a more competitive marketplace for it, so that now you had people who were, perhaps already certified, nurse aides who, weren't getting paid as much working in an actual facility as they could be if they were working directly for an individual. And actually thereby it helps, both people. The nurse aide gets a better rate of pay, and the person in need gets a better quality of health care. And it helps create kind of a competitive market space for it as well. But, now it's continued to expand. I mean, it's been around for about 15 years now. And it has really expanded into a lot of these other domains where, you can find everything from, people who clean your home to, a handyman to any of those areas where you might need to pair up, some kind of individualized employment for whatever your personal need is. So I thought it was worth pointing out, one of the women helping to lead innovation globally.
That's a good ad. And I'll add another one who's tech based that I just saw him recently on TikTok. So are you familiar with Justin Khan? I think that's how you say his last name. The guy who was one of the founders of Twitch. He cashed out with the Amazon deal, but he had posted something the other day, and he's like, when we're starting Justin.tv, which for those who don't know the story of Twitch, Justin.tv was how it started. And then it was initially him live streaming just his life. It was like him walking around. He had this backpack thing, and then it turned into, people putting things on Justin.tv and kind of it morphing into Twitch. And one of the things he was talking about in one of his videos was they got to a point where they were running all on VC money and they were just losing money. So they were going through their burn rate, and they're like, okay, we need to start making revenue here. What can we do? So he gathered everybody in a room. He's like, okay, I want to put everything on a list, anything and everything that we can do to make money. We're going to put it down here. So they all sat down in a room. He's like, okay, we can run ads. Okay, can we run a lot of ads? It's like, so they were literally just throwing things on a wall and testing it to see what they could do to get the business profitable. And he goes on to explain that in about 6 months' time, they went from being at a really high burn rate to actually generating revenue, and then getting it to the point where it was Twitch, and they figured out a formula to serve the people they saw who were streaming on there, which is mostly gamers, and iterate and tailor the product towards them. So I thought that was just a great example. And I didn't know that story totally of how it went from Justin.tv to Twitch, but I thought it was a really interesting study. And he's pretty active on social media. If I see him on LinkedIn now, but he's pretty active on Twitch and Instagram. So you should check him out if you get a chance. He's also a big, mental health guy. So he talks about meditation and wellness. So he's right up your alley, Brian.
Love it. Yeah, I'll have to explore him a little bit more. Well, I appreciate you throwing his name into the ring as well. I'll kind of finish with one last of my own, and she's a name that is already very well known because of her association with Facebook primarily. But Sheryl Sandberg, part of why I thought she was worth bringing up. I mean, not only has she had her tenure both at Google and Facebook, but she took her wealth and influence and created the organization leanin.org that is really predicated on helping establish sort of this new front line for executive female leadership globally, which again I've heard sort of counter arguments from folks who typically end up being in the male category who have some resistance to the idea of well, why do we need more female leaders? But again, I think from the perspective of having a plurality of views in solving any issues, right? I mean, that's where the greatest improvements come from. And certainly as we continue to work together with greater equality, I think that those end up creating values, not only to good companies, but to good societies. And so I really respect the work that she's doing in that domain. Certainly Melinda Gates has also, had some very similar work that she's been doing as well. But, as we start to see, leadership in particular, really be something that is more common across both gender and racial, prior barriers. I think it's the kind of thing where, we'll see more and more innovations that continue to emerge because we are looking at things with a variety of perspectives versus just being in our own, echo chambers of how these things have been done in the past.
That's great ad. I feel like the DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a big topic right now, and I feel like it's just getting ready to explode. We're just on the beginning cusp of this. And, we definitely need to bring somebody in to talk about this from a leadership perspective, because I'm not an expert. But I remember reading this great quote from Brene Brown. It was like, belonging, what is like something is allowing someone to come as who they are instead of letting them come in and fit into your culture. That hiring for a culture fit always creates an echo chamber. And I'm sure I butchered that quote, but it sounds something along that line. So I think that's a great topic and something that a lot of organizations are starting to realize that, all these years of hiring for a culture fit is they're leaving people out because they're just basically hiring people that are similar to them. So you are seeing organizations hire people who are chief people officers. They're not just human resource individuals anymore because they have more responsibilities. And we're even seeing things like organizations dropping requirements for college degrees, especially in the tech sector, because you don't need a college degree to figure out how to work AWS. I mean, there's tons of courses online and get a certificate and never touch college and make $150,000 a year easily. So we're on the cusp of all that stuff just starting to happen, I feel like.
Yeah, I think so too. And, there's a very interesting analysis that was done in the early 1960s about the movement of money, and west is the direction that money moves, just in case you were wondering. And so this this particular book by Carl Oglesby called The Yanking Cowboy War is the one in which he really sort of spells out this westward trend of the movement of money. And so, of course, here we are. We just came out of an episode with Lance Mortlock very recently, and he talks about from a consultative perspective, what are one of those areas that are top disruptive concerns, and it's the emergence of China as the next global economic superpower, which if timing goes the way that it's projected, will arrive in 2028. So the westward trend of the transference of money does also not necessarily equate to the transference of innovation, but you can bet where there's money, there will be more innovation. So it'll be interesting to see what emerges from China in the next decade or so. China has not had a reputation as being an innovator. They've had a reputation of ripping off ideas that are already existing in the marketplace and, borrowing from other existing intellectual property and then building their own variations of it. So it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues as their economic strength rises, or if, in fact, they do take a world position in terms of being innovators.
I mean, you make very great points. And when we talked to Lance, I thought about that a lot too. And I think a lot of it comes down to them respecting intellectual property. And you brought up the great points, right? They, a lot of, or like, you always see stuff in China, right? I remember seeing this thing at Top Gear. Jeremy Clarkson goes to China and he's like, here I am in Beijing. And he's like, I've got my fake polo shirt on, my fake Louis Vuitton bag. I got my fake Tommy Hilfiger jeans. It's just like fake everything. But I agree, as they come more prominent on the world stage, it's going to be interesting to see how they play to that, because, at least in more of the Western cultures, intellectual property is more recognized and respected. Not always. I mean, we even see instances of organizations here, straight stealing stuff from other people. And sometimes in the tech space, a lot of that happens with open source projects. Somebody will borrow something and not read what license it actually has, don't give anybody credit. So I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in the Western world, because, obviously
just read
it does.
The Pirates of Silicon Valley.
Exactly. So, I mean, it does happen here. It just doesn't happen as often. And we've got a legal system to go through, to take these things. So it should be interesting, like you said, to see how all this plays out over the next 10 years or so. Maybe in 10 years, we're still right in the same place we are now. Who knows? I mean, nobody has a crystal ball, right?
That would be unfortunate. We often ask our guests about books related to innovation. So I've got one in mind, and I'm curious if you do as well, Nick.
Yeah, I would say so for innovation, for me, the first one that comes to mind is Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy. I'm blanking on his last name. Yeah, Andy Grove, the longtime CEO of Intel, co-founder. And they're one of the original big silicon tech companies. But if you think about Intel's trajectory, they were top of market from inception all the way to maybe like 5 years ago when AMD started, plugging at them. But if you think that's a long run in tech, a really, really long run in tech, to keep that innovation and that iterative track process. So that's just a good read in general about his thought process and mentality and how he started Intel and how they kept fostering a culture of, keeping that trajectory of Moore's law, basically.
Yeah, that is one of my top favorite leadership and management books of all time. It's a phenomenal read, and I'm glad that you brought that up. For me, there's you mentioned Walter Isaacson with his biography of Steve Jobs. He followed that book with another book called The Innovators, And that is a fascinating read. In fact, it's one of the few books that I've read twice. I loved it so much. I went back through it after I finished it and read it a second time. But it is, sort of chapter by chapter, it goes through all of these variety of people who have been innovators, in their respective domains. And he focuses it largely around what is the basis of computer technology. But he begins it, all the way back in the era of Ada Lovelace, right? The daughter of Lord Byron, who is often credited as being the first programmer, and goes through, decade by decade and sort of era by era, covering a lot of ground with all of these innovators in the tech space. So it's a great read. It's hugely entertaining. If you read his Steve Jobs biography and you enjoyed that, or any of his other works, this one is one of the best that I've ever read by him.
I'll have to add it to my list. I did enjoy the Steve Jobs biography. And I came out of that realizing, at least for me, Steve Jobs was a great innovator, great technologist, great marketer, great product guy. But he seemed like a terrible family man. It's like, and to me, that's important for me as a parent when I read the stories of him and his interactions with his children. I'm just like, man, I don't know if I want to be that innovative, that popular, and feel like I fail so much on the other front. But that's just my 2 cents on that book. I don't know if you felt any different.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. And I think he, admitted that openly, and that's part of the reason that he chose to have Isaacson, really depict him as accurately as possible, warts and all, which I think is commendable. He recognized that he wasn't a great person with relationships, and particularly when those relationships came to the relationships with his own children. And not to justify it, but when you consider that he himself probably only ever met his father unknowingly when his father was the maitre d' in one of the restaurants that he frequented, because as an adopted child, he never had any sense of who his parents were. So that's got to do a number, on your emotions and your mindset as well. So I think
can't even imagine. Oh.
You see a lot of that sort of characteristic of abandonment carry over into, how he interacted with, his daughter Lisa, but, with his children at large. So I guess that's the caveat that we append to our tale of innovation today.
Yeah, we kind of went all over the place.
Just be a good person while you're doing it.
Yeah, I guess with that, we'll wrap up. Thanks for listening. We appreciate everyone, whether you're one listener, thousands of listeners, or if you listen to one episode or every episode, we always greatly appreciate that. If you could go ahead and leave us a review in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you're getting your podcast, let us know how we're doing. Give us 5 stars. Leave us a review. I'd actually like to go through reviews sometimes and read them at the end of this. Like if somebody leaves a funny review, I totally want to read it on air. But if you could just go ahead and do that for us, we greatly appreciate that. If you found this episode value or any episode value, if you could share it with a friend or a coworker or colleague, it'll just help us grow the show and help us, reach new listeners. And as always, if you have any information you want to talk to us, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Nick Lozano. Brian's Brian Comerford. And I am also on Instagram at Ronin Janitor and on TikTok at Ronin Janitor. So if you see me cruising around there, be sure to follow or connect, and let's take this conversation offline. I'd like to meet some of our listeners offline. It's always fun running into people that way.
Well said. Thanks, Nick.
All right. Thanks, everyone.